Good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Kratz. I'm the Vice President of Education here at the National Building Museum. And for those who are joining us for the first time, let me start off by telling you that the Building Museum was created by an act of Congress in 1980 and housed in this historic, amazing pension building. We're a private nonprofit whose mission is to advance the quality of the built environment by educating the public about its impact on people's lives. And we do this through our innovative family programs, youth and outreach events, adult lectures, such as tonight, exhibitions, and the museum discusses issues related to architecture, planning, landscape architecture, engineering, and design. And chief among those are issues for community development and an exploration of our urban environment. The museum is proud to be a neutral forum for dialogue on these important issues. A quick plug for our next program. This series continues on April 10th with a panel titled Industry to Art, exploring how Rust Belt cities are transforming aging factories into art galleries, producing annual cultural events to draw outside visitors, and even offering grants to help artists relocate to new cultural districts. Panelists will include the president of the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust, the co-founder of Detroit's Powerhouse Productions, and the architect who designed Arts Quest at the former Bethlehem Steel Foundry in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It will be moderated by Vice Chairman of HR&A Advisors, Candace Damon. This series is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Arts and McGraw-Hill Construction, and we'd like to thank them for their support. Now, on to tonight's program. Cities are increasingly being defined by their cultural amenities, such as museums, theaters, parks. The increasingly mayors, cultural leaders, and business community are supporting the construction of new cultural facilities to encourage investment in underdeveloped areas, improve the quality of life for residents, and attract members of the creative economy. Tonight, panelists will review what is the real impact, economic impact of cultural institutions on their region economies, how do you even measure that, how organizations are planning for sustainable growth, and how they create a long-term community engagement strategy, among many other topics. Each speaker tonight, our format will be each speaker will give a short presentation about their work. This will be followed then by moderated discussion, and we'll conclude with Q&A from you all. So our speakers tonight, in this order, are Joanna Woronkowicz, who is the author of the University of Chicago report called Set in Stone, which we'll hear more about this evening. She is currently the Senior Research Officer at the National Endowment for the Arts, an Associate at the Cultural Policy Center at the University of Chicago, and an Assistant Professor of Nonprofit Management at Indiana University's School of Public and Environmental Affairs in Bloomington. Randy Cohen is the Vice President for Policy and Research at Americans for the Arts, the nation's advocacy organization for the arts. A member of the staff since 1991, Randy is a noted expert in the field of arts funding, research, policy, and using the arts to address community development issues. He publishes the National Arts Index, the annual measure of the health and vitality of the arts, as well as the two premier economic studies of the arts industry, Arts and Economic Prosperity, the National Impact Study of Nonprofit Arts Organizations and their audiences, and the Creative Industries, an annual mapping study of the nation's 905,000 arts establishments and their employees. And finally, our third panelist tonight will be Christiansen, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. Located in Kansas City, the museum opened its doors in the 1930s in a beautiful Beaux-Arts designed space by Kansas City architects White and White. In 2007, the museum opened a new expansion space known as the Block Building, designed by architect Stephen Hall, that added 165,000 square feet to the institution. As part of that same capital campaign, the museum also opened the Ford Learning Center with classes and an education resource center, which opened in 2005. And our moderator this evening, we're very fortunate to have Inga Saffron, the architectural critic of the Philadelphia Inquirer. With that, we'll have Joanna take it away. Joanna?
For being here today. There we go. So this study, Set in Stone, Building America's New Generation of Arts Facilities, came out in June of 2012. So today I'm just going to give about a 7-minute overview or something of something that took up 5 years of my life, but happy to do that. So it came out of the University of Chicago and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, as well as the Cultural Policy Center there. So we had a team of researchers working on the study, and oh, there we go. Thank you. So we had a team working on this study, and really the reason that I wanted to show you the names and the titles of these people's, of course, to give them credit, but also just to show you that we had a range of different people from different academic disciplines, as well as different perspectives approaching these questions about cultural building in the United States. We had everybody from an economist, a couple of economists, to a survey methodologist, to a social psychologist, to a historian, et cetera. So we really tried to get a good roundabout picture of what was going on in regard to cultural building. The reason that we decided to go forward with this study was really because it was the field, consultants in the field, as well as foundations, really informing us that there were substantial investments being made into bricks and mortar of cultural facilities, and that these organizations were approaching challenges either throughout the process of planning and development of the facility or after the facility opened. And therefore, there was this need to really have a data-driven study that we could come to conclusions about best practices to pursue facility development projects, as well as sort of what are the benefits of having cultural buildings in our communities and in our cities. We studied museums, theaters, and performing arts centers, and we studied both new constructions and renovations, and we studied all projects that were started between 1994 and 2008. And this panel is sponsored by McGraw-Hill Construction, and that's actually who we got our data from. McGraw-Hill Construction is also in the business of collecting building permit data, so we really had an exhaustive list of all of the cultural building projects that were started during this 15-year time period. So just a brief, what we did in the study, we assembled a census, so we were able to say how many building projects were pursued and how much building cost. We chose a random sample of projects and we studied their planning and development processes. We talked with executive directors, board trustees. We then also interviewed organizations in a community that had a major facility project but did not pursue their own facility project in order to examine the spillover effects that these projects have on other cultural and nonprofit organizations. And we also developed a series of case studies that are all available on our website, which I'll show at the end here. So the 4 research questions that we were really trying to answer was 1, what was the extent of cultural building? 2, why did cities and organizations invest in building during this time period? What were the characteristics of successful projects? And also, what was the impact of building on communities? And here you see how much building actually took place during this time period. So you see here that there was indeed a substantial increase in facility building, particularly between 1998 and 2001, and we call this the building boom. And building altogether came to about $26 billion throughout this entire time period. And this $26 billion wasn't on fitting out the facilities, so furnishing the facilities or giving them technological amenities, but it was really just the bricks and mortar of these facilities that cost about $26 billion throughout this time period. So there was a lot of building going on. I think one of the most interesting visuals I'll have today is actually this map series that I'll show you next. And this is just going to show you the areas in the United States throughout this 15-year time period that had at least one building project throughout this time period. So you'll see here it starts to populate. And it gives you a sense of how widespread building really was during this time period. So it just kind of gets darker blue and darker blue. But after analyzing these projects, we found indeed there was this building boom that took place throughout this time period. Performing arts centers, so these very large facilities, multidisciplinary facilities with multiple performance spaces, was a prominent form of building. Building actually grew faster than or on par with other social sectors, particularly education, building in the education sectors and building in the healthcare sector, which was very interesting to see. And then we also saw a lot of building taking place in the southern region of the country. And of course, our hypothesis is maybe the southern region didn't have as many buildings to start with, and that was true. There was a lot of cities particularly in the southern region, that were trying to play catch up in a way to other cities across the United States. And then also, surprisingly, and I think different than other building booms that we've seen, smaller cities, those with less than 500,000 people, were really heavily engaged in building cultural facilities as well. Some of the reasons we identified, in addition to sort of some of the political and social reasons for building, we also looked at economic and demographic reasons for building. Some of the reasons we identified that cities built, for example, we saw growing populations and higher average levels of education and income. And when we ran our statistical analyses, these were really the three primary determinants of how much and whether or not a city decided to build a facility. But we also found evidence for the supply of facilities appearing to have exceeded the demand for them. We measured demand in a lot of different ways: the number of arts organizations that already existed in the communities, the financial health of the cultural sector, and then we did a lot of analyses that compared it to how much investment was being put into new supply facilities. And the conclusion we came to that there was an overinvestment during this time period in facilities. Now, I think one of the most useful parts of this report is the best practices section, where we talk about the feasibility of building projects. And while I won't go through each one of these different elements, this kind of gives a good description of the four different characteristics that we looked at in the planning and development of facility projects that were very important to the success of building projects. So you see here the leadership. Leadership is very important to the success of a project, the motivation behind a project, the implementation of the project, as well as what the project's outcomes were. And again, if you go into the report, you can actually see this detailed a little bit more, but I just wanted to give you a good visual for what we identified here. And then finally, in terms of the effects that we saw these facilities have on communities, we actually saw no clear pattern of spillover effects, either positive or negative, as a result of building a cultural building in many communities that we studied. Our hypothesis is that a big building project might divert resources away from other cultural organizations, other nonprofit organizations. We did not find evidence for that being the case, but nor did we find evidence of every cultural building project having a positive spillover effect in the community as well. So really, research in this area is still ongoing. We also saw few organizations viewing themselves as competitors, which we thought was very interesting as part of this study. So 9 times out of 10, we would ask an organization, who is your competitor? And 9 times out of 10, they would say, no one. So we thought that was pretty interesting. And then we also found limited evidence that cultural building had significant effects on the overall changes in the number of arts organizations, their employment, or payroll. So that was really trying to get at the hypothesis that building actually makes cultural organizations stronger. So to end, our 4 case studies that we highlight on the website is we have the Art Institute of Chicago building their new modern wing, the Long Center in Austin, Texas, the new Performing Arts Center down there. We also have a case study about the AT&T Performing Arts Center in Dallas, and then the Taubman Museum in Roanoke, Virginia. So really, really interesting stories that I think are very vividly told in these case studies available. So you see here all of the resources that we try to provide for organizations and cities trying to build. There's a number of things that if you go to our website, which is listed here, you can find as well. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Randy.
Thank you. All right. Okay, thanks everybody. Well, I'm going to talk about the economic impact of spending by arts organizations and their audiences. So, we just heard about these wonderful facilities, but, what's happening to all those people, or what's the behavior by those people that come to these arts events? Now, so I want to challenge you to, think about the arts as an industry, but you know what? I don't want to forget the fundamental reason for the arts in our communities. They inspire us, they delight us. The arts are part of a healthy community. And actually, just to sort of illustrate this, I thought I'd just bring out real quick a flute that was found 25,000 years ago. I'm sorry, it's a 25,000-year-old flute that some anthropologists in Germany found. And what was interesting is, they were studying past civilizations. They were trying to figure out in this article, now, what was the purpose of this flute? It's this beautiful piece that, it makes music and everything like that. And they thought maybe it's involved, it's to help promote territorial expansion. Or maybe it was to celebrate the hunt, or perhaps related to the fertility ritual. I just kept thinking maybe they'll like the way it sounded. That never showed up. But, the art's with us a long time, and actually just something else you can find nearby here at the Crime and Punishment Museum, the shame flute. So this flute thing really stayed with us, right? So 25,000 years later, this is the 1700s. Well, this is made out of cast iron, and the shame flute was actually clasped around a person's neck, and their fingers were shackled to this iron tube. And the purpose of the shame flute was to punish bad musicians. So, yeah, if you got a gig at the Prince's Palace and you stank up the joint, well, they'd march you around for 2 days in the shame flute, so everybody could laugh at the bad musician. And, sounds barbaric, but they cared about their music, right? So, just to, remind us that the arts are a fundamental component of our humanity, of what it is to be an individual, and they have been for a long time. So we want to stipulate that now and think about the arts as an industry. And to quantify that, we did a study called Arts and Economic Prosperity. It was looking at the economic impact of nonprofit arts and culture organizations and their audiences. Think of the last time you went to see a play. Well, maybe you went out, did a little retail shopping, bought a new necktie, jumped in the car, went out, had a nice meal, got to the theater, paid for parking, went into the theater, used the facilities, went into the auditorium, you see the big, beautiful chandeliers, you've got the program all about the play you're about to see. Well, think about all the industries that are affected just on a typical night out at the theater. Well, you're going to buy your tickets online. You got computer programmers, you got web designers. You go to a restaurant, you buy a nice meal. That provides income for the waiter, for the owner of the restaurant, entrepreneurial income. You get to the theater itself, and even things we just take for granted, like using the facilities on our way in. Right? Doesn't matter if you're this big, beautiful building here or our house. We all need a good plumber. Right? So, arts organizations support all kinds of jobs beyond just those, when the curtain goes up and we start to see the performers on the stage. And so that's what we really tried to capture as part of this study. We studied 182 regions from across the country, including DC was one of them right here. And we were in all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. Big national study. What did we find out? Spending by nonprofit arts organizations and their audiences, $135 billion of economic activity every year. Billion with a B. Now let me break that down into two numbers. Spending by the organizations themselves, $61 billion. Now that is a myth buster for a lot of people because, we love the arts, they create the communities that we want to live in. But the fact is, they're businesses. They employ people in the community. They purchase goods and services locally. They're involved in the marketing and promotion and tourism development for the region. Arts organizations are good business citizens. And that $61 billion leverages an additional $74 billion. And that's that event-related spending by arts audiences. And we'll drill down into that a little bit shortly. But that $135 billion, again, just the nonprofits. Doesn't include individual artists, doesn't include the for-profit industry, all critical components of our cultural ecology, but just not part of our study. We talk about government support, private sector investment. Well, those dollars are typically going to nonprofit organizations. So it's appropriate to ask the question, well, what's the public getting in return for that investment? And that's what we tried to track down here. So we draw a very specific box. I'll just mention we collected data from about 10,000 nonprofit arts organizations. We gathered 152,000 audience surveys across the country. And we work with a team of economists from Georgia Tech School of Economics who customizes input-output analysis models for every community that we study. So we use a very reliable economic analysis for this. So what do we find out? What's the economic impact of that spending? Well, it supports 4.1 million jobs in this country. And remember, those are jobs not just at arts organizations, those are jobs in a whole range of industries. But, it's all resulting from that spending by those arts organizations. Now, a little something about arts jobs. Arts jobs are necessarily local jobs. These are not the kind of jobs that are going to be offshored. Why? If we go to the symphony and, we see a first violinist and 99 Macintosh computers, we're not going to be happy, right? We want all the musicians up there. And, maintaining the arts education programs right here in this building, it takes, professionals doing that work and the curators at the museum. So it's a very labor-intensive industry. Bottom line, the arts, not just food for the soul, but putting food on the table in over 4 million households in this country. Well, what else did we measure? Government revenue. Government revenue at the federal, state, and local level, we estimated over $22 billion. Now, that's against a collective outlay of $5 billion at the federal, state, and local level. So you start to see, those dollars going out are investment in an industry that's providing both cultural and economic benefits. The fact is, you talk to elected leaders these days, they've got 3 priorities: jobs, jobs, and jobs. So this is very powerful information, both at a national level as well as local levels also. All right, so arts organizations are businesses, right? And, the fact is, every business has an economic impact. The dog catcher's office, a gas station. I could give you a $5 bill and my economists will scurry after you, and a million calculations later, they'll have the economic impact of that. But very few industries generate the kind of event-related spending that the arts do. And what we found in 152,000 surveys in communities across the country, the typical attendee spends $24.60 per person per event beyond the cost of admission. And you can see, how this breaks down. About half of it's on food and, a little bit on ground transportation. So you might be looking at lodging now, wondering, can you really get a room for $3.51 still? And would you want to if you could? No, you wouldn't. Remember, these are averages. Not everybody has an overnight stay. Well, in addition to how much you spent at that arts event, we asked folks another question. We asked them for their zip code, because we wanted to find out, do they live in the county that the arts event took place? Are they local? Or are they from outside the county? Are they non-local? Nationally, 32%, 1 in 3 arts attendees travel from outside the county to attend that arts event. And does their spending differ? Yeah, you bet it does. It averages close to $40 per person per event beyond admission. And it's more on the things you'd expect: transportation, food, that's where you see some of those lodging expenses. We asked those non-local attendees one more question, and that was, quite simply, why are you here? You're here on business, you're here visiting family. 59% of those non-local attendees said, we came specifically for this arts event. So then we asked the local attendees a question. We said, if this arts event weren't taking place in your community, would you have stayed home, done something else? 48% said, we would have traveled to a different community to attend a similar kind of arts event. So you see then that arts and culture is a product. And when we invest in that product, we're drawing people to that community, and those people are spending money. And not only that, we're seeing the holding power that the arts have. Art spending is a discretionary expenditure. And the fact is, if you're here in DC and you're an economic development person, you want that money staying right here in DC. So the big takeaway is a vibrant arts community is good for local merchants. So the big story then, the arts are not a luxury worth supporting in prosperous times, but maybe hard to justify when the economy is struggling. Rather, it's an investment in an industry that supports jobs, generates government revenue, and is a cornerstone of tourism. Thank you. I'll pass this off to you.
Thank you for including me in the panel. I think this is going to be very interesting. I want to frame a little bit about the Kansas City Metro. Has anybody been to Kansas City, Missouri? Or Kansas City, Kansas? Yeah. Anybody to the Nelson-Atkins? Okay. Okay, I can go home now. No. But let me frame a little bit about the city, the Nelson-Atkins, but also our process as we went through it for the campus enhancement program. Picture of Kansas City. Kansas City Metro, if you think of a big round circle and a line down the center, you've got Kansas on one side, Missouri on the other, or Missouri, depending on your preference. And down the middle is State Line Road. And it really is a road, and it really is a state line. Within that circle, on Kansas and Missouri, there's 15 counties that make up the Kansas City Metro. About over 2 million people living there. We have a very, very lively cultural center and scene. We'll talk a little bit more about where some of those areas are, but performing arts, gallery scene, all of that. Probably our newest downtown skyline member, and this is in Kansas City, Missouri, is the Kaufman Center for the Performing Arts. Opened in September of 2011. Architect is Moshe Softy. 2 theaters that you can see. Let's see if I can get this right. Here, a total of 3,400 seats. The Kansas City Ballet, Symphony, Lyric Opera, particularly are housed there, but others use it as well. As we look at the Nelson-Atkins, let me give you a little sight. This is not oriented correctly because this is actually north. This is actually south, east, and west. The Nelson-Atkins here is on 22 acres. While the Kaufman Center is downtown, this is considered midtown. So we're a little bit further south. Those of you who know Kansas City probably know it well. The square footage of the buildings, the Nelson-Atkins building and the Block building, is 400,000 square feet. We have parkland to the west of us, the south of us. We've got beautiful homes and neighborhoods to the north and to the east of us. Around all of that is an amazing array of cultural, entrepreneurial, and science organizations. Can you see? Am I in your way? Okay. We have the Kemper Contemporary Art Museum. We have Kansas City Art Institute that trains artists. We have the University of Missouri at Kansas City. We've got the Kaufman Foundation that really specializes in entrepreneurial activities. We have MRI Global that does research, scientific research like sleep studies. And we have Stowers Institute that is looking at cancer research. So a wonderful array. Further west of us is what we call the Country Club Plaza, which is a very lovely, beautiful open-air shopping center. Real quickly, again, Nelson-Atkins itself, in 2001, we went to free general admission. We had been charging $5, but we decided to be free general admission. Our attendance for this year will be about 390,000. When we opened the Block building, just as a point of comparison, it was at 453,000. Our operating budget is kind of 24 to 27 million a year, depending on exhibitions and programs, and we have about 300 employees. Less than 2% of our annual income comes from any federal, state, county, local. It really is about individuals, corporations, and foundations. These are our 2 lovely founders. And Mr. Nelson wanted art in the city. Miss Atkins wanted a museum. They never met. When they both passed away, it was their heirs who actually came together and created and put all the funds together to create the museum, which I have always found fascinating. This is a rendering of the building of what it should look like and all the grounds. Again, we're on 22 acres, so here's the building and all the beautiful grounds. You notice this wonderful title up here, William Rockhill Nelson Gallery of Art and Atkins Museum of Art. That was the name of the museum 4 years. It wasn't until the 1980s it was changed to Nelson-Atkins. That was the letterhead. I don't know about you, but I always found that kind of mind-blowing that we had such a long title. But anyway, this is the building built with the park grounds. I point this out particularly to you because this area is where the where the block building will actually go. So, let me see where we are. Let me now move to a little bit of the campus enhancement program. You may wonder why in the world I'm showing you a parking garage. Well, it's a beautiful parking garage, but aside from that, we found as we were communicating the project that we were not really communicating very effectively because in the house, we always said the building project. We knew exactly what that meant. It meant all 6, 7 phases of the building project. As we started talking to the community and raising money, most people immediately went to the block building, one particular part of the phases. So we stepped back and started talking about it as a campus enhancement program because we built a parking garage, which was the first phase. We did a central plant. We redid Education Center, now called the Ford Learning Center that Scott mentioned. We put in our own storm sewer lines because the city's infrastructure couldn't handle it. We did many of those kinds of things well beyond just building the block building. This is, at least for Kansas City, a unique garage in that these are 12 and 14-foot ceilings. It is an entry to the museum. Most people drive in Kansas City, so as you come down the ramp, the entrance to the museum is straight ahead. 450 spaces. Now, this is an interior shot, and I'm just going to show you a few shots because when I was practicing this on a couple people, they thought the garage picture was up too long, so I thought you'd want something else to look at. Plus, it's a beautiful picture. In fact, my office is right up in there. Not bad, huh? I don't know how I managed that. But let me talk about the process. We first the trustees really stepped back and looked at the vision. What do we want the institution to be? What do we want it to do in the city? How do we want it to not just look physically, but behave? From there, they wrote a strategic plan with lots and lots of input from the community and really took that vision and made it into strategies. That strategic plan is actually still on our website. It was adopted in 1998. It was a 20-year plan. If you read it, and I think that all of you should do that at night sometime, especially if you have insomnia. No, it's actually a very good plan. It talks a lot about the building and what we need to do to add on. I don't think I mentioned, but when we opened the building in 1933, I wasn't there at the time, but when it was open, they only opened half of it. They built, the 234,000 square foot building, but they only opened half, which I think is an amazing thing in the 1930s. And they did that because they wanted time to grow into it. That is one of the reasons we did not have to do anything from 1933 to literally like 2000. From the strategic plan, they then did a program, and it was all about relationships and adjacencies. What room needed to be next to what? What were special requirements that had to be in the room? Special plumbing, special electrician. We like plumbing, I've noticed. What are those special requirements that we have? From there, this is Noguchi Court, which is one of my favorite places in the block building. From there, we did a feasibility study into fundraising, and we did it 2 ways. We hired consultants to actually go out and do a formal feasibility study, and then we had 2 volunteers who headed up what we called the Generations Campaign, because that campaign was all about raising money for building for the next generation. And they went out and kind of tested to see what they found. And we selected the architect in 1999, and they had already raised $58 million before we even had an architect, a design, a concept. It was done from the strategic plan and the program because there had been rigor and people understood the vision and where they wanted to go. By the time we raised all the money for the campus enhancement project, less than 1% of it came from federal or state. We went then to a architectural selection committee. They had a huge list of architects, narrowed it down to 6. They spent months going internationally looking at buildings that these architects had built. I was not on that committee. I don't know how I managed not to be, but I wasn't. But anyway, they went all over the world to look at the buildings, came back, had the 6 architectural firms come in, give a presentation, then a selection was made. From there, went to a building committee, and they obviously watched the budget and made big decisions and all of that kind of thing. This is literally the rendering that we put in the paper when we announced Stephen Hall. So the Nelson-Atkins building and what we call the lenses, often referred to as jewels. You'll see that there are 7 lenses. We actually only built 5. Stephen, I think, is still disappointed at that. But it fit in our budget, and it fit in our square footage requirements. So this is 165,000 square feet. Let me show you, this is it done. This is what it looks like now. So again, the Nelson-Atkins building, the block building. I might mention, some people think or imagine that each of the lenses is a separate building and that we built like 5 buildings. Actually, the building, most of it is below grade, the gallery spaces. The lenses allow light in to the spaces. And you also see we have sculpture kind of on top of them as well. Very quickly, and before the hook comes and pulls me off, I might also mention, because I love this fact, that this, if you took a 67-story building and laid it on its side, that's what the block building would be in terms of kind of size. The block building, again, with 5 lenses, one of the reasons I think we were successful, and I do think we were successful, and I appreciate I have a biased point of view, but is that Mark Wilson, who was the director at the time, and Stephen Hall, the architect, developed a really important and close relationship. They very much respected each other. Mark Wilson absolutely embraced the design concept. And so in meetings when one of us would go, no, we're not going to do that, he'd remind us of the design concept. Stephen and the other architects understood the need for functionality. And it was a really wonderful relationship and a very good communication between us. We also, which is a big one for me as we think about talking, we focused a lot on operating funds and endowment. I cannot tell you how many hours that I spent, you know, thinking about the utility costs. What would we need in terms of staffing? How much extra toilet paper are we going to need? I mean, you have to think of all those things, you know, the maintenance of it, the cleaning of the floors, all of those kinds of, how much paint we're going to need every time we do an exhibition. And we spend a lot of time on it, and the trustees wanted to know. So I would do run rate after run rate and kind of push it at assumptions and that kind of thing. So we raised endowment money as well to operate the building, and I think that's huge. We also had a communication plan. We regularly communicated, with our neighbors, as you saw on the original site map, because there was a lot of them. And we communicated with them, sent them newsletters, had meetings, all of those kinds of things. We also sent staff out to groups to make presentations. And then we did what I call, and these are my words, the cocktail circuit. Kansas City is a very social environment, and so there's lots of events, lots of parties and things going on. And so most of our trustees were invited to those things anyway, but we also had a lot of staff involved. And so we did a lot of work making sure that all of us knew how to answer questions, and or if we didn't, what were some of the things people were hearing that we then need to think about in terms of communicating back out. Yes, there were criticisms of the block building during construction. People weren't sure they liked it because it looked kind of strange. I don't know if any of you followed some of the press. I know you did. But for one period of time, it was viewed as the Butler building. It was really thought of as really a bad thing. So we had a town hall meeting. I thought Stephen did an amazing job of explaining the intent. The director was there. It was a very good thing. We opened in June of 2007, and that was the last of the whole phases of the campus enhancement project. Oh, there. I show you that only because I like it. So thank you very much. I don't know that you need this.
Well, thank you very much. The most interesting part of this for me are the buildings. And I do remember this period that Joanna talked about when there was just a huge number of cultural facilities, museums and concert halls being built, and all the architecture critics were like constantly flying somewhere to review those buildings. But then the recession hit, and then some arts organizations ran into trouble, and very often the buildings got blamed. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about, are we too focused on the buildings? Do you want to take that?
Start?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Randy, did you want to, or Joanna?
Go ahead.
Oh, well, you know, it's interesting, traveling around the country, I certainly, you know, there was huge building there during that time period as well, which I think, you know, it's just nice to see that, because it's what it felt like and what it looked like. And, you know, in a sense, you know, a building, you know, even though they may cost hundreds of millions of dollars, are almost the easiest things, you know, to do, because it's got a big name on the front, you know, and there's a big there, and everyone can really get excited about it. And it's just interesting, you know, now you travel around a dozen years later, and, you know, folks that didn't do what you did plan for, you know, who's going to occupy and populate those buildings with that cultural product, you know, that's supposed to be presented there. You know, some of those places are really struggling, you know, and you see that big museum addition is, you know, maybe dark, or, wow, that fabulous piece of architecture, or the glass ceiling in the lobby, you know, it costs $40,000 a year to do the windows, and they didn't really plan for that ahead of time.
There have been some notable examples. I mean, most people know about the Folk Art Museum in New York, which built a fabulous new building right near MoMA, and then only a few years ago had to shut it down, move out, sell the building. It's a real tragedy. The Denver Art Museum, also fabulous building, had to lay off staff, curatorial staff. There's a couple of museums in Philadelphia, where I'm from, the National Jewish Museum and the National Constitution Center, that have really struggled because they didn't plan for operations. They overestimated attendance. That seems to happen a lot. Joanna, can you talk about, you know, on one hand, these institutions do this because it's an easy way to get the public interested, to get donors interested. It's a lot easier to raise money for a new building than to raise for maintenance or programming. Can you talk about those problems?
Yeah, you know, I don't think having a large focus on the building is anything negative. I mean, I think we saw a lot of institutions have a large focus on the facility. It turned out really well. The planning development went really well. I think when we saw institutions run into problems, we saw there wasn't a connection between the building and that organization's mission. And you hear it over and over and over again. As a nonprofit, you have to keep in mind what your mission is. But I mean, there are really tangible ways that people successfully connected mission to facility development. I think, for example, you know, if we're thinking about accessibility of our programs as a nonprofit organization, we saw design elements be implemented in order to provide accessibility. So you see a lot of buildings now being built with glass walls and fully transparent from the outside. Everyone from the outside can look in. The New World Symphony is a very good example of having a design element like that in order to...
Miami.
In Miami Beach, Florida. That's a really good example of actually helping with accessibility and using a facility project to deliver on mission. So I think focusing on the building is not necessarily bad, but focusing on the building without focusing on the mission and what the organization is using that building to do. So the building, almost the facility, should be used as a tool for serving on mission. If that's not taking place, that's when we run into problems.
And I do think, if I might, I think it's important, as you think about the building, what do you expect to happen in the building, because that's going to drive design and the use. We wanted a lot of open, big spaces for people to gather. So the block lobby is quite large in that. So it seems to me more and more, I agree, I don't know that focusing on the building or that we focus too much on buildings, but I think the programming and activating the space is now the really important issue for many people, many museums.
Karen, one of the things that struck me when you were talking was the way you described how you calculated all your future costs. A lot of institutions hire consultants. I was wondering, did you do that yourself? Did you work with a consultant? And one of the things I always hear with institutions that run into problems is consultants almost always overestimate their attendance, what their future attendance will be.
Yeah.
So did you do that yourself, and how did you keep yourself from falling into that trap?
I did do it myself, although I asked, I asked lots of other cultural institutions that had just built buildings what they had found. So I did a lot of testing and benchmarking to see that I wasn't running amok. I do tend to think of expenses high and income low, just by who I am, so I tend to be kind of on the conservative side. But then I would meet with our finance committee, and we'd talk about my assumptions and where they were right or wrong. So I think I had a lot. When I say I did it myself, I don't mean I didn't do it in a vacuum, but I tested it a lot.
Did you have a consultant?
Mm-mm.
And why not?
Probably the most, this is probably not a very good answer, but in some ways I don't think we ever thought of it. And I know this is being taped, and boy, am I going to hear the end of it. But I think it was felt that that we had, between a finance committee, our finance department, our networking that we do, that we had the tools to do it. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, I haven't had that much fun in a long time, because I do love doing those. But even if I might extend past the building for a minute, we are looking and working on a new strategic plan, because the old one really is expired. And it's going to much more focus on community and programs. But I'm doing the same thing for how much is that plan going to cost us to implement, because we aren't going to be able to do it all at once. So I think that rigor is important at every institution, and I don't think we're the only ones that do that by any means, but I think that rigor is very important. Mm-hmm. Did I answer?
Yeah, sure. To take sort of the counterpoint of view, given how often institutions overreach, given the limits on funding, the struggle to maintain staff and to raise money for just ongoing operations. What are other ways? Maybe we should stop thinking about, we're going to expand, we're going to get a great new building. What are other ways that these cultural organizations can have an impact on the community outside the box?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at the national trends, if the share of the United States population attending a live arts event or an art museum, for a decade has been in a downward trajectory. And on the other hand, personal creation is on the increase. People making art, 275,000 choirs, 14% of the nation's household, with at least one quilter in it. We see more dance schools, more college degrees conferred. The research seems to suggest that there's more interest in personal engagement, personal creation in the arts. And, so I think the challenge is, the arts aren't in trouble so much, but some of these traditional delivery mechanisms are struggling. And that business model where, I give you a stack of money, you sit me in a dark room, show me what you're going to show me, and kick me out the door I came in through without giving me an opportunity to talk about it or see what you were doing or how you did it or what was going on or how it was made. is a struggling model right now. And you gave a great example, the New World Symphony in Miami. They do their concerts. They've got the wall casts. You sit in the park right next to the symphony, and you can watch it on the wall. And they've got they've got daytime half-hour concerts for $5. So they're really thinking about how is demand changing, and and how do we reach those folks? So I think the organizations that think about that and innovate that way, are continuing to prosper.
Yeah. We see organizations, I was just going to add to Randy said, popping up right now all over the place that are focused on community engagement in whatever way that they can. So say they might use a building to do that, but we see the Trey McIntyre Project is a very good example. It's an organization out of Boise, Idaho. They don't have their own facility. They go into their community spaces and perform. I mean, we see people breaking the mold of traditional business models in the arts, and it all comes down to engaging with the community in whatever way you can.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of discussion also about getting communities that wouldn't normally go to a museum or a concert hall to attend some kind of cultural activity. So by not focusing so much on the building, but by focusing on maybe some kind of festival or performance in a public space, that might be another way to engage people who wouldn't ordinarily be engaged. Do you have favorites of those kinds of events?
Well, just up the road, the Baltimore Symphony did the Rusty Musicians Project recently. And, got this wonderful conductor, Marin Oslop, and every night you take her bow and see, wow, the crowds are getting a little smaller, they're getting a little older. And so they put out a call to the community that said, if you're proficient in an orchestral instrument and you know how to read music, you can perform in a live concert with the Baltimore Symphony. And then please, cross their fingers, please somebody call. Within 24 hours, 400 people signed up. And, they had almost close to 700 people. They had to stretch these concerts throughout the year. So they engaged people, on one hand, looking for a more active personal creation. But then these tickets, I think, were like $12 or something. And family, friends, coworkers, a lot of people who had never been to the symphony came to see this performance. It's just one example, I think, which is a real interesting one.
It is a good one.
Karen, I was interested when you said that the Nelson-Atkins is free, and I know the Cleveland Art Museum is also free, and in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Museum of Art is trying to find a way to have free admission. That's certainly a great way to get people in who might be afraid of the cost of going to a museum. How do you manage that?
It's interesting because I'm part of several consortiums of other museums, and we always debate free versus charging. And Cleveland, Minneapolis, for example, is also free. It is a real value that we have at the institution, at the Nelson-Atkins, that we want to be free so that every person has access to the museum. We've gone so far, we charge for parking, but we have a free parking lot, so that we really want to reduce the barriers to having anyone feel like they can open the door and come in. When we decided to go free, though, the trustees said, if you want to go free, it's important for it to be revenue neutral. And by that I mean that if we're going to be free, you don't just take what you used to raise from admissions and make external affairs or the development department now hit a higher goal in order to cover it up, or cover the resume, or cover the admission, sorry. So what we looked at is, while we're free general admission, we do charge for special exhibitions. They're a premium to us, but you can still see beautiful art. We leverage it by, if you're a member, you get into special exhibitions free. So that's a way to leverage the membership. We charge for parking, but if you're a member, you're free. But again, we have our free lot too. And then we started putting a donation box out all the time. And one of our security officers, God love him, said, well, why don't we say, gee, we're free, but a donation would be welcome. And the minute we started doing that, people started dropping money in. Because the trustees asked me to, I have kept track from every year from 2001. if we would have charged admission, what it would look like, you can tell like spreadsheets and numbers. And based on the admissions that we've made, every year except the first year, we've actually made more income under this model than under the old one. But I think, honestly, it becomes a decision that the organization decides to make. I sometimes hear people say, well, we can't afford to lose that income. And we took it from a different point of view. We took it, we want to be free because we think it's the right thing to do. Now, how do we do it?
Maybe I'll switch here a little bit. There's been a lot of discussion about, in cities, of using the creative class to renew rundown areas of the city. And of course, Richard Florida has talked a lot about this. Do you think it works? And maybe we can also talk about the after effects. Do you want to talk about that, Joanna?
Sure. So this is on video, right?
But you can say whatever you want.
Yeah.
Don't be inhibited.
I think Richard Florida really brought up a good point that arts and cultural amenities can help spur development in cities, and that's certainly the case. However, I think in interpreting his work, and I'm not quite sure if it was the interpretation or the presentation, we tended to think that it was a standard formula, that if you put a cultural institution in a city, in a downtown, there will be transformation development overnight. And in my opinion, and I think in my opinion, where I've looked at cities, I've looked at population growths and economic indicators after a cultural institution has gone in and seen what's happened, there is no standard formula for that occurring. And it's more about nestling a cultural institution into the existing infrastructure of the community and seeing how it can work within the dynamics that already exist there. And I think when we run into problems, when we see cultural institutions get built and struggle with revenue generation and the existing area not develop as quickly as we wanted to see, it's when that institution was not couched within the existing infrastructure. And there's very good examples of cities and institutions that have been couched within the existing infrastructure. One is there's an arts incubator project in Washington Park in Chicago right now that is going into a pretty distressed area of Chicago, and there's no talk about what this cultural organization will do for the community. It's all about how the community will be interacting with the organization and the benefits that both will derive from one another. And so I think if it's viewed upon that way, then it's a healthy way. But if it's viewed upon putting in amenities in order to attract a certain population of people being a standard formula, we run into problems.
Right.
There's we work with the Conference Board, and Conference Board is the national organization for the Fortune 1000 companies in this country. They give you the leading index of economic indicators, consumer confidence index, and the like. So they survey business leaders, and what they have found is that for business leaders, creativity has moved to the top 5 applied skills that business leaders are looking for in their workforce. In fact, it's even leapfrogged the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Although I think when we talk about it, of course you have to be able to read, write, and do math, but if you can't take those skills and bring some creativity to it and optimize an existing product or create a whole new market, those are the jobs headed overseas, where if you could say, wow, 10 years ago, who knew we all needed an iPad, and here it is. So there's the impact of creativity. Those are the jobs here. And what's interesting is when those business leaders are asked what are the indicators of creativity, unfortunately, there's no real typing test for creativity. How do you know if you got one on the line, in terms of hiring one? Well, study of the arts, and especially while in college, or starting your own business, entrepreneurial activity are the biggest indicators of creativity. Now you work your way down the list, 27% actually cop to the checkbox. We assess creativity based on the candidate's appearance during the interview. So thank God for anonymous surveys. I would have never had the guts to check that box. But so as these business leaders, seek to attract, these creative workers, what they're finding is, domestically, internationally, this cohort, of this innovative workforce are looking, one of the things they look for is, creative, culturally vibrant communities. They want to live in cool places. Now, it's not necessarily just like a brand new building or something like that, but, and so, we're seeing a lot of interest in, by business leaders in the importance of creative, arts-rich, energized cultural communities, because attracting a skilled and educated workforce, is just the big thing on their list these days. Because if that's where the workers are, businesses will follow. So, there's an interesting phenomenon happening there, that the business scholars, in studying the business leaders are looking at. 72% of business leaders say creativity is of high importance. 85% of those folks say, we can't find the people we're looking for. So there's a lot of churn going on in that area of the business scholarship, which I think is very interesting.
I'd like to just play devil's advocate for a moment on this issue, because this has almost become like a formula. There's some depopulated part of a city, artists move in, they're kind of an advance guard, making the place safe, so to speak, and discovering real estate, and then other people move in, and this whole process of gentrification occurs, which brings its own problems. But and I would like to talk about that. But first, what I think of the movie Rent, and I think of artists like in the garret suffering, and it not being an organized government process. Do we lose something when we try to take control of this process?
Well, I think it happens probably more organically than top down. I'll say that. But cultural districts, in cities in Pittsburgh and St. Louis, and across the country, the phenomenon really does seem to happen. That the arts can transform an area, but I don't think you can social engineer your way to it, if that's your question.
I think as long as there's support, it doesn't matter whether it's top down or bottom up, honestly. I mean, we can think of some communities across the US that were probably more organically, created into cultural meccas, Asheville, North Carolina being one of them. Those places, it was a group of people who got together and created the community because that was already, the community those were their characteristics already. But we also see, I think we also see very good, successful examples of cultural districts. I would probably say Durham, North Carolina is a very successful city that had a very top-down approach to creating their district. But what was important there is that the city government wanted that to be done, and there was support from all sides of the city government. So it's really just about it's getting the support you need, top down, bottom up, whatever.
One of the interesting things you said during your presentation was there was a real spike in cities under 500,000 people investing in cultural institutions and arts district. Can that population really support multiple cultural venues?
A lot of these cities, these smaller cities, a lot of them were building for the first time. So a lot of them did not have a facility to even begin with. Paducah, Kentucky is actually a good example. Paducah has, I think, about 25,000 people, and it built the Carson Center for the Performing Arts right on the river there. And who would have thought that 25,000 people would go to Broadway in Paducah, Kentucky? Well, they're going. I would not say, those types of institutions that have a smaller population to support them, they have different types of struggles. They have struggles with programming, I would say, and For example, their executive director might come from the arts world and want to put on very experimental and breakthrough programming, but their community won't support that type of programming. So that's, I think, the different types of the struggles that you you run into with smaller communities. But I do think that there are smaller communities out there, and we saw a lot of them that were able to support an institution.
Okay, thanks. Well, why don't we open this up to the audience? Are there anyone who has a question? Oh, I see someone back there.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to ask actually about, I guess, from Joanna's presentation, she mentioned positive spillovers, and I was a bit surprised actually that it didn't seem to be so much of a correlation with that. But so what comes to mind, of course, in terms of businesses is restaurants. But I'm wondering if you could speak more about that maybe, and from, say, an urban design perspective in terms of proximity of, if an institution is in a neighborhood, it's embedded there, and that presents the opportunity from an economic development perspective to capture, let's call them customers, but and presents the opportunity then for spillover businesses. And so, of course, certain institutions, because of their spatial characteristics, perhaps like the Nelson Museum, because it's a giant campus, enclosed campus, that would be more difficult. But so I'm wondering, if you could just speak about that, please.
Yeah, so just to clarify, our study actually came to the conclusion that we didn't actually see evidence for either positive or negative spillover effects. So we saw some positive in some communities, some negative in some communities, and really nothing happened in a lot of others. So, speaking to those communities that you did see restaurants start popping up, I don't really know whether there's, again, a reason why specific communities kind of, that happened and other ones didn't. But, it happens. I can't really give any more of an informative answer than that. But, yeah, I think the conclusion of our study was that we actually didn't find evidence for either occurring.
Karen, were there any restaurants or new businesses that opened after you expanded?
I can't think of any. The plaza, which is the shopping center a little bit west of us, has gone through a huge transformation. So they were kind of in their own throes as we were building. But I can give perhaps a slightly different example. We have an area of town called the Crossroads. And the Crossroads started as artist lofts, and it kind of goes to your earlier question. And the city and particularly some corporations really wanted it to succeed. And because we have the Art Institute across from the Nelson, there were a lot of artists looking for loft space. We were really supportive because we like the whole concept of the artist community. Well, they took over a particular area kind of near downtown, and we saw a tremendous impact there on restaurants, fascinating boutique shops, completely different than those that you might see at Country Club Plaza that maybe are a little more formal. I'm not sure the right word. I don't know that that's exactly to your point, but it's been interesting and very well. People love going down to the Crossroads area. It is. I mean, you have to park miles and miles away in order to really participate in everything. Now, perhaps some of the reasons why around the Nelson-Atkins not as much is we built our own restaurant, and we kind of hoped you'd come to our restaurant. And so, but we certainly didn't preclude anybody from opening one. How does that do? Actually, it does well. It does well. Museums, when we talk to each other, always talk about food service and whether, I think some people think it should balance the budget, and it really is. It's an important amenity. It's not necessarily the thing. I mean, we do have a lot of people who come there just to have lunch or to have dinner, but it's not a freestanding restaurant. Like, it's not open when we're not open, if that makes sense. So it's really there to serve the people who visit.
See a question in the back? And
My name is Wilfried Eckstein. I'm from the Goethe Institute, so I apologize for my stupid questions not being too well aware of what's going on in the United States. But I'm here for exactly that question that you asked at the end, the moderator. Sorry, I don't have your name. And I have the impression that what you talked about, all the museums and all the icons and the statistics, were more about iconic buildings. It was not really about developing a rundown area, for example, like Baltimore or something. So we were not talking about, in a way, anchor institutions. We were talking about museums and the impact and what's the effect, the spillover effect. And that's actually my question now. Is that true? Do I observe that correctly? I also would like to memorize a little bit about what I read recently. It was, I think, Edward Glaser, a book that talks also about the future of the city and the role of cultural economy. And he says that basically creativity may come into those areas, may come into such rundown areas, but still there is this disparity between creativity and job creation, because creativity alone does not create jobs. It still needs technical skills. It still needs a certain, in a way, take the community at your hand and develop even the janitor and the technician and the engineer and so on and so forth. So it's a completely different talk, to talk about anchor institutions or to talk about, well, what we heard, icons of the, in a way, aesthetic life of a city. Is that true, or would you correct me on that?
Big institutions.
Well, we looked at facilities that were, I mean, we looked at, I don't want to call them icon facilities because a lot of them we did, I mean, they were, not all of them were $350 million, but we definitely looked at facilities being built in areas and seeing what happened afterwards. So,
oh, I'm not really sure to answer. I'll say this, in terms of tourism, you know, the tourism industry finds that travelers, and this is both a domestic and international phenomenon, look for more than just the big major institution. In fact, they're looking for very, you know, authentic cultural experience. So it's those smaller institutions, you know, what's the story, what's the heritage of the community, you know, what are some of the, you know, cultural differences in those arts organizations as well. I'm answering a different question, but that's one response.
yeah, I will actually note one thing. The Tides Foundation, I did a webinar for them, and the audience for that it was for sustainable spaces, and the audience for that webinar was, they were smaller nonprofits who weren't necessarily interested in building their own facilities, but were interested in how to utilize the existing space that they had better and collaborate with other nonprofits already in the area. So, I mean, there was a very large audience for that, so I think that's probably more that what you're getting at for talking about anchor institutions.
For the Nelson-Atkins Museum, as you were doing, you said you held some town hall meetings as you were in the planning process. Were those done to just inform the public, or were you looking for feedback as well? And if so, did any feedback from these town hall meetings actually affect or change how you proceeded with the development?
We did a little bit of both. Some were sharing information about the project. We had many sessions asking people for feedback. And the particular one I mentioned when Stephen Hall came in, it was a very spirited debate because at that particular time, people were very frustrated with the building because they, as I said, they thought it was ugly, it wasn't what we represented, it was all of those kinds of things. I don't think that there was a particular aspect of the building that we did differently, but what it taught us from all the feedback is that we were not doing a very good job of communicating outward in terms of end result or how we were going to use it. And that was a big lesson for us, that we needed to, some of us were so busy working on the project, we kind of this is embarrassing, but we didn't spend as much time out as we probably could have, and that was a really valuable lesson, and then we started to make the change.
I know there's some questions up here in the front.
The other end.
Oh, wrong side. Sorry. Very experienced. I live I live across the river in Alexandria, and on the waterfront we have the torpedo factory. I don't know if you're familiar with it. That's a readaptive use. So aren't artists around the country looking for that? That happened like more than 50 years ago, and it did develop Alexandria. And it is a tourist city as well as a historical city. I don't know if you're familiar with Alexandria, Virginia.
I live in Old Town.
You live,
Yeah.
Okay, I live in Del Rey. Okay. So, which is well, then you understand what I'm talking about, right? So, aren't artists looking for readaptive use? And I think the museum has sponsored programs on Detroit. So I would think, that's really down now. The state is taking over the city. But artists, wouldn't they be interested in developing something readaptive use instead of new buildings costing so much?
I think that
isn't anything going on like that?
There's tons of that, and for a couple of reasons, there are a lot of cities have a lot of vacant older structures, industrial structures that artists love. One, and secondly, it's a lot cheaper than building a new building, and it can do more for the city. In Philadelphia, which has a very active fringe festival, the city just made available an old pumping station, a beautiful 19th century brick pumping station, to be the headquarters for the Fringe Festival. So they'll have their offices there, and it happens to be located on the waterfront also, like yours. And the city's had a real struggle to redevelop its waterfront. So it's in a very pivotal location, so it'll bring people to the waterfront. They're going to run a cafe out of the old pumping station, so people won't just be coming when the Fringe Festival is having its season, but they'll have reasons to come all the time. And it's part of a larger kind of redevelopment of this lost waterfront. So, I mean, I think there are hundreds of stories like that. And I definitely think it's a very competitive alternative to building a new building.
Not to be the naysayer, but I'll do it. We saw a lot of readaptive uses going on as well. I would not say, though, that they are, in general, cheaper than building a new facility. We saw a lot of issues pop up with readaptive uses, from excavating and finding environmental problems. And the challenge with those types of projects right now are that the guidelines to do a readaptive use are much stricter than they were when the torpedo factory was built. So still or when it was renovated or readapted, and so those types of hurdles are present for institutions going into them.
Hi, I'm a retail market analyst. So what my firm does is we do a lot of work with municipalities like Durham, actually, to help them improve their retail conditions and figure out how much demand they actually have for retail and what kind. Anyway, I wanted to know, we do a side project called Vibrant Streets that talks about the importance of cultural and civic anchors to make a vibrant retail street, and we actually have that as a step process. So we have that later in the steps. So I think when you say you can't just you can't just throw something cultural in a street that's not already vibrant itself is definitely correct, I think. But my question is, and maybe it's for Karen or Joanna, do cultural organizations do demand calculations before building a facility? I know that you guys said that you have an idea of how many people each year are going to come, but how do you do that? We do a lot of, that goes into our demand calculations for retail when it has a cultural use, so I'm interested in how you do that.
I wouldn't say that we did perhaps as formal of a demand analysis as as your organization does, although I think it's a very good idea. We did it much more, perhaps more informally back then in terms of the community's sort of tolerance, not just for raising money, but for enthusiasm about the construction, enthusiasm about the organization in terms of wanting to see it expand. So I can't say that we do it nearly as scientifically as maybe we should have, but we definitely tested the community and even the region, because while we mostly pull from the Kansas City metro area, about half of our visitors come from the states around us. So we also did send some feelers and tried to find out if we were, if there would be the demand. But again, we were one of those spikes in terms of when we, damming the torpedoes and we're going to build it. I think there's a little bit, and maybe this is to the question about the building, the old phrase, build it and they will come. I don't hear that as much as I used to, and for many reasons. Yeah. And so we were very interested in understanding how many people we thought really would come. Did I answer? Kind of. Not very, but yeah.
We have a few other questions in the back.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, hello. What have you guys seen in terms of the success of city planning and neighborhood planning and community development that has incorporated cultural planning and that has not? Because we hear a lot about, arts organizations and culture being so important to neighborhood vitality and people's community and the sense of belonging and happiness and wonderfulness and everything. How have you seen, the impact both economically and kind of civically for neighborhoods that have used cultural planning and neighborhoods that have not?
So 2 examples that have already been mentioned, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. One is, again, the New World Symphony project in Miami Beach, Florida. So when the New World Symphony, which was an existing institution, decided that they wanted to build a new facility, they went to the city and they said, hey, we want to build something. We want to take those parking lots over that are across the street. They said, okay, we're with you, we support you, but first we're developing a master plan for the area. So they actually went through years of a process to develop the plan for the area. And again, I really do think that's a really great example of a project that's been a resounding success throughout the field. Durham is another great example of that. That facility, that cultural facility was built, and to a lot of people's dismay, was built not in order to serve the other local arts organizations, so not to give them a space, not to help them out. It was built as an economic driver through and through, and that was the primary intention behind that project. And if you ask anybody, the mayor there, the Economic Development Corporation, the city manager, they will say this was the developer and the architect, they will say this was an economic development project, and it was, again, couched within the city. So I think those are 2 examples of urban plans that included a cultural facility that were thought out beforehand.
I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you. And I think you just talked about what I wanted to raise, which was, it seemed to me, or I interpreted the discussion, that the boards or the trustees were the ones driving this, and what was lacking was the political decision or the public decision. And it may not be the correct time for us, or politically correct time, to raise the role of public policy or politicians or government. But I think that aspect is necessarily important, and I would think would play an important role.
I would just say there's a lot of behind-the-scenes lobbying that takes place with these projects. Mm-hmm. Things that you probably don't hear about when you read the newspapers, and things that you really hear about when you go out to these facilities and you talk to the representatives of them. People going to the state legislature and lobbying for a tax to get passed in order to help fund it happens all over the place. And so again, I mean, it's like any other thing I think that we're used to, where it's not something that you plan and it happens, but there's a lot of support that you have to garner in order for things to actually take place.
If you look at that Arts and Economic Prosperity study that I shared, If you turn to the back of the report, you'll actually see organizations that are national partners on that. The U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, Lieutenant Governors, U.S. Chamber of Commerce on down the line. And those organizations, that is the national organizations for our appointed and elected government leaders, are on board with this because they believe that the arts are part of a healthy community, a fundamental component of a healthy community. It's different everywhere, and then additionally, I think they buy into the research and the methodology is the other piece. So, as a general idea and concept, I believe elected leaders, do largely value that.
Well, I think we're at time, but I'd like to thank our panelists and our moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you.